us pray. From our forests and parkland to our prairies and mountains comes the call of our land. From our farmsteads, towns, and cities comes the call of our people, that as legislators of this province we act with responsibility and sensitivity. Lord, grant us the wisdom to meet such challenges. Amen.
Introduction of visitors. Presenting petitions. Reading and receiving petitions. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Notices of motions. Introduction of bills. Tabling returns and reports.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table certain annual reports required by statute: the annual report of Athabasca University, the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology, the Alberta Foundation for Nursing Research, the Alberta Council on Admissions and Transfers, and the statistical report for the Department of Advanced Education.
Member for Calgary-McCall.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table the annual report of the Alberta Alcohol and Drug Abuse Commission.
Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to table, for the interest of honourable members, the 1987 Alberta Municipal Assistance Program booklet outlining an inventory of grants and programs.
Introduction of special guests.
Minister of Agriculture, followed by the member for Lethbridge West.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure, sir, to introduce to you and through you to members of the Legislative Assembly 28 outstanding students that we have from the Pine Street School in Sherwood Park. They're here with their teacher, David Harvey, and two parents and dear friends, Jan Bradley and Linda Lovig. And I would ask if they would rise so that they could receive the traditional warm welcome of the chamber.
Lethbridge West.
Mr. Speaker, seated in your gallery today are some very special people in the form of our legislative interns. Mr. Speaker, Alberta was one of the first provinces in Canada to institute this program, and this year, from over 80 applicants, Mr. Speaker, who applied for these positions, we have the winners who are serving their term in the gallery today. I'd like to introduce them, Mr. Speaker, and have them stand and be recognized as a group. Catherine Brommel from the U of A, Andy Fost from the Camrose Lutheran College, and I might add that this is the first graduate from the Camrose Lutheran College to be eligible as an intern. Sean Mellon from the University of Lethbridge, Michael Watson from the University of Alberta, Timothy Wild from the University of Calgary, and Craig Wood from the University of Lethbridge. I'd ask that they rise, Mr. Speaker, in your gallery and receive the warm welcome of the members of this Assembly.
Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, it is my pleasure today to introduce to you and to members of the Assembly 23 special guests in the Members Gallery from grade 6 and the Aldergrove School in the riding of Jasper Place, and they are accompanied by their teacher Paul Gish and the parent Robert Hale. I would ask that they rise and receive the cordial welcome of the Assembly.
Ministerial statements. Oral question period.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to direct the first question to the Treasurer. Mr. Speaker, financial statements issued by First and Associated Investors for 1985 and 1986 showed the companies basically to be insolvent. Mr. Speaker, we know this because the companies released their information in the Securities Commission, but of course still the government file remains a secret. Now, Mr. Speaker, under the Investment Contracts Act, the government had this information well before it was made public. My question to the Treasurer, did the government issue operating licenses to these companies after it received this information?
Mr. Speaker, again, there's a sequence of events that has been noted by the Leader of the Opposition here. And, of course, I would not want to get out of sync with the sequence of events which has taken place. This information, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the Leader is well aware, will be well presented when the code inquiry takes place. The only point that I can make is that with respect to the judgment as to the solvency of a company, it's not an easy question to answer simply by looking at the so-called financial statements, although that is one major guide. But I think, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the way in which this question has been posed, which both asked me to express some view about the financial viability of a company going back some period and also to be involved in some sequence of events, it would be inappropriate, given the fact that the code inquiry has now taken place, to proceed with that kind of an answer.
Speaker, I was not, we know the viability of the companies, there's no doubt about that. I was asking the Minister if he issued operating licenses, but Mr. Speaker, the accounting firm of Deloitte, Haskins & Sells advised the government in respect of First and Associated Investors that the firm's assets were grossly overvalued, and to the tune of an asset base of these two companies was inflated by more than $11.5 million. Now, Mr. Speaker, obviously the government should have had this information. My question is, again, why did the government issue these operating licenses to these companies to remain in business?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think a point just on the order in which this process unfolded might be worthwhile. It should be noted that the application for the licenses goes back some time. I haven't got the exact date, but I understand it's close to 30 years. And over that period, the company continued to operate, and the companies continued to operate in Alberta and in Canada. And over that period, there was an annual assessment which was done based on the normal financial regulatory applications or tests which are applicable to this particular group of companies. So it wasn't a question of continually to agree or not agree to issue the license, but at some point when I was involved in this, I found, at least in my judgment and the advice that I received from a group of professional people, that the company was not viable. And that decision was made towards June 30th, 1987, at which point the licenses of the two contract companies were lifted or revoked. So they had a continuing operation, but when, in my view, the company was not able to, on an ongoing basis, continue to be viable and satisfy the asset tests which were referred to by the Leader, and also the profitability tests which were also referred to here, then, in fact, in our judgment, the company was not viable, and that's when we acted in the best interest of the contract holders.
Yeah, their best interest, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure there'd be a debate about that. But my question to the Minister, surely somebody gives operating licenses. The fact that they've been there for 30 years should not be determination of whether you keep getting operating licenses, Mr. Speaker. And even in 1985, the Alberta Securities Commission declined an application by First Investors to issue preferred shares on the market. Surely that should have been something for...
Two statements so far, Honourable Member. Let's have the question, please.
Mr. Speaker, my question is, in view of the fact that the Securities Commission turned them down, do you deny that the government issued operating licenses to First Investors after this happened, when the Securities Commission turned them down?
Well, once again, Mr. Speaker, we find a case where a point in time has been a reference, and therefore drawing conclusions from that point in time, as I mentioned yesterday, the after that effect, which is a classic form of fallacious argument. And what you can only draw from that, if you make a case on one point and something happens subsequent to that, is that the first event caused the problem. It is unfortunate that that kind of argument is here today, Mr. Speaker, because it's not the case. Now, when you have a situation where somebody goes to the market and the market does not respond, then you have a market-sensitive application. But other events may take place and other processes may be in place which, in fact, have intervened between the date that is conveniently picked and the conclusion of this process. The point I'm making here, Mr. Speaker, is that you can't draw any conclusions from the point just made by the member from Norwood as to the outcome of these companies. This process is going to be very difficult to explain. It's taking a long time for experts, a tribunal of experts, I might add, lawyers, accountants, and others to sort it out, and it's now being done. At some point, Mr. Speaker, this report will be made public. The maze of transactions will be explained. The decisions made either by corporations, investors, or the government will be outlined. And I'm sure Mr. Code will draw some conclusions from this, and the people of Alberta will draw some conclusions as to what happened. That's the process. But to argue that one event triggered the downfall of this company, or that the downfall of this company was premised on some prior information, is not a logical argument and is not accurate.
Mr. Speaker, we weren't talking about one event. We're talking about a series of events. Mr. Speaker, the Ontario government wisely turned the principal companies down for registration to do business in Ontario in 1983, Mr. Speaker. So obviously they could make a determination. My question is, knowing all this information, not just one event, knowing all this information, why in the world did the government keep issuing operating licenses to these companies, Mr. Speaker?
Again, Mr. Speaker, what is a matter of record, Mr. Speaker, when this government was elected in May of 1986, we proceeded to deal with a variety of problems in the financial institutions. At that period, just after election and during the period of the first sitting of this House in the summer of 1986, it is a matter of record both here that there was considerable debate about financial systems, including among those Northwest Trust, the Heritage Savings and Trust Company, the credit unions, and now in this one, the Principal Group. And so over that period, Mr. Speaker, it is a matter of record that the government, in fact, did deal with these issues. We moved as expeditiously as we could. We recognized the concern of others who have expressed that you want to maintain the financial institutions in this province, but at the same time applied a very careful analysis of all of these financial institutions to come to a conclusion as to their financial and profitability in the future. And working upon those decisions, you saw that we worked through a series of steps to deal with the financial institutions of this province. And on June 30th, as I have noted, it was our conclusion and our information that these two contract companies were not viable, and therefore we revoked the license. One event did not trigger it. A series of careful analysis was at the heart of the decision, and it took some time to come to that conclusion, Mr. Speaker, involving this large number of people who provided expert information to us and whose I'm sure dependency will be defended when the Code Inquiry completes its work.
Supplementary. Calgary, Buffalo.
Yes, to the Minister, when did officials of his department first advise him of problems with respect to First Investors and Associated Investors, and what steps did he take after that to protect investors and not just the company?
Perhaps the Minister would like to answer the first question. Only one question is allowed.
Again, Mr. Speaker, I think this question would be more appropriately found in the Code Inquiry. I think this is under his investigation. This explanation will be given by everyone who is available. I've indicated that a considerable list of government ministers and employees have been requested to testify, and we will give our full cooperation to the Code Inquiry, wherein we will set out either by correspondence, by decision documents, or by imperfect memory in some cases, but memory at least, as to the events which took place. And that, I think, is more appropriately expressed in front of the Code Inquiry, who's now conducting that investigation.
From the reps. Procedural information at this stage to members of the House. Yesterday, the chair ruled out of order 2 questions, or at least tried to get that wonderful phrase of reserving judgment to determine admissibility of the questions. With regard to the last 2 questions by the Leader of the Opposition, the information has been exchanged between the Speaker's office and the Leader of the Opposition, and the Leader of the Opposition intends to designate a second question today, so now the Chair recognizes that the Leader of the Opposition may indeed ask one of the questions that occurred yesterday and one of the 4 questions that were in the second question, and you see part of the fun of being the juggler when it comes to question period. Leader of the Opposition, 2 questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll try to read it to make sure that I stay in order. On my third question from yesterday, it's a very simple one, Mr. Speaker, in view of the fact that thousands of Albertans have lost millions of dollars, my question is, eventually, who is going to take the political responsibility over there?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we've made it clear that it's probably not one entire group that will take the responsibility. I think it's safe to say that Mr. Code is looking at all aspects of the problems affecting the Principal Group Limited. There seem to be at least 4 different groups now who could be essentially involved. One was the decision-making group, the management and the board of directors, if you like. The second was the sales force, or the Principal Consultants Limited. The other was the government, and still finally the last one was the investor. All of these people at various points had their own decisions to make as to how to operate. The political responsibility will fall, I think, on those people. It won't be uniquely defined in my view, but it may well be that in terms of the government's role, as our Premier said, should Mr. Code make a recommendation or a suggestion or the court order that in fact the government was entirely or partly negligent in its it's the teacher coming out of the member from Norwood, I can see that. I appreciate it. Then, of course, the government will respond accordingly, and that in fact, is our position. But I think, to a great extent, the recommendations of Mr. Code will be at the heart of that explanation.
Yes. Yes, I had the urge to go on, Mr. Speaker, but I'll come back to the question from yesterday. The minister has announced, Mr. Speaker, that he's prepared to give $10 million to accountants and lawyers to clean up this mess, and that's a political mess, Mr. Speaker. And my question was, in view of the fact that this shows that this government was clearly negligent, they didn't do anything for 4 years, would the minister now, instead of giving the money to the lawyers and the accountants, turn this money over to the investors, Mr. Speaker? They're the deserving people.
Mr. Speaker, I've tried to make this explanation before, and now I can see why the member from Norwood is a teacher, because he does not understand the financial way in which the markets operate, or in fact the way in which liquidation takes place. And I'm sure as well that's why he remained the leader of the opposition. Let me go on to say, Mr. Speaker, that in the liquidation of corporations, which are either in receivership or in bankruptcy, fairly significant charges are assessed against the estate or the remaining assets of the enterprise. And they're assessed for various professional purposes. I agree that lawyers and accountants tend to have higher wages, or perhaps are fairly elaborate in their charging practices. I'm saying that in the privileged room here, by the way. But in any event, there are major costs involved in this process, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, if the government has indicated that we would pay some of the costs of liquidation of these companies, well, what does that mean? That means instead of the estate or the money that's available for distribution to the contract holders being paid to the liquidators of the 2 companies, in fact, that money will be available to be distributed to the owners themselves, to the contract holders in this case, to the contract holders. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, while I have estimated that the cost of the liquidation of these 3 companies, the Principal Group Limited, the 2 contract companies, will be fairly significant because of the size and the complexity of the process, anything that the government does to assist these companies for the Alberta contract holders themselves will simply enhance the distribution of assets back to the contract holders. So it isn't going to the professionals, it's going directly to the contract holders. Now, there is a second intonation in this question, Mr. Speaker, and I have to deal with it because, of course, well, I'm sorry, when the member raises 2 questions, I have the right to at least deal with it, unless you cut me off quickly. When the member from Norwood suggests that the fact that we're assisting the contract holders in a variety of steps and processes which we have carefully outlined, which we think draws to the advantage of the contract holders themselves in terms of the provision of money for legal counsel, in terms of setting up a special committee, in terms of some of the costs that I just referred to. We're doing that not because we believe we're guilty, but because we believe that this has been a very difficult sacrifice for these contract holders, and we're trying to do something on our behalf to assist them. It is not an admission of guilt at all. It's an expression of concern, and that distinction should be made.
Designated second question, Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to designate my second question to the member from Calgary Forest Lawn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The people of Alberta, particularly those in the Lloyd-Minster area, have been waiting for over 3 years for the ground to be broken and an upgrader project would bring extensive economic benefit to the province. Indications are that the province of Alberta and the province of Saskatchewan and the federal government are close to completing a deal in this project. I have a few questions about that project this morning, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister. Will Alberta's participation in the upgrader project be restricted to direct equity investment, or will there be any other sort of royalty relief or any other kind of financial support provided to this project?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is correct in that the discussions around the project have been going on for some time. And of course, the collapse in world oil prices had a significant bearing on the setback in activity in the on the non-conventional side of the oil industry. And of course, that caught the Husky project as well. But since the world prices have come up and non-conventional projects are looking more economic than they have in the past for a variety of reasons, the discussions did continue on, or start up again, I should say, on the Husky project, particularly between Alberta and Saskatchewan initially, and Huskies at the officials level, and then eventually Alberta, Saskatchewan, and the federal government. And so the proposal that was put to Husky this week was a joint proposal from the federal government, the governments of Alberta and Saskatchewan. I have indicated publicly, Mr. Speaker, that the three governments have indicated their desire to participate in this project in an equity way, but saying anything beyond that, I think at this stage would be inappropriate in view of the discussions that are going on.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I want to know, and I think people of Alberta have a right to know in terms of this free trade agreement, whether the government of Alberta is proposing to put more into the deal than just equity. A simple yes or no from the minister on that question is warranted for the people.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member and the people of Alberta, if and when an agreement is reached, will find out the details.
Well, my concern is that if we are considering putting royalty into that, what implications would that have for the free trade agreement?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we all know where the party that the honourable member is a member of stands on the free trade agreement, which is at odds with the development of the oil and gas industry in this province. And we intend to work with the federal government and the government of Saskatchewan to see that these projects go ahead. And because of the free trade agreement, we see a significant demand for development in the non-conventional oil sector in the future.
Mr. Speaker, final supplementary. The minister still hasn't answered my question. I'll put it in slightly different terms. What information does the minister have about our ability to provide incentives to construction and operation of a production facility under the terms of the Mulroney trade deal? Will he share that information with the Assembly?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member should know, and it's been made public, the free trade agreement, the details, the legal document, of course, is yet to come. But as far as incentives to the development of our reserves in this province, that is in place. We will be able to continue to do so in the future as well.
Westlock Sturgeon.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to have a supplemental continue the very important question started by the member for Forest Lawn. Would the Minister of Energy inform us as to the reason for the delay in going ahead with the plant is because the federal and provincial governments have to get clearance through Washington, because Washington would consider it a bottom load subsidy competing with their own independent oil producing. Are you waiting for Washington to give clearance for the project?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we obviously do not have to go to Washington to deal with this. The problem in the past, Mr. Speaker, has not been Washington, it's been Ottawa when parties that the honourable member is the leader of this province have been in office there have been the main problem.
Supplementary, member for Wainwright. Supplementary.
As to the Minister of Energy, do you have the some cost figures on the upgrading of the heavy oil in the Wainwright Lloydminster area?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Main question, Leader of the Liberal Caucus.
To see their backbench doesn't have any more success than we do. This question I'd like to direct to the Minister of Agriculture, and it involves free trade. And certainly the worry I think many Alberta taxpayers have as we do put a lot of subsidies, loans, and grants into agriculture, Mr. Speaker. The Americans generally call this bottom loading. In other words, although it's not increased for the price for the product, it does allow the product to be produced more cheaply. So I would like to ask the Minister of Agriculture, particularly the first one, for instance, there is his company talking about, or his government's talking about a trial program for paying the pro-rate subsidy to farmers. Has that been cleared with the U.S. authorities to make sure that that will not be considered a bottom load subsidy?
Mr. Speaker, in response to the honourable member for Westlock Sturgeon, I would refer him to the agreement that has been initialed, because there it makes specific reference to the Western Grain Transportation Offset, whereby those goods that are shipped through the West Coast ports for delivery to the U.S., they have raised objection to that provision, whereby there was a payment to offset the transportation costs. As it relates specifically to canola, what they have done is they're going to remove the ad valorem tax of 7.5% on our canola going to the U.S., and the two will offset each other.
Mr. Speaker, that was not exactly my question. It was on the trial program that the money would go into the pockets of the farmers. However, let's move on. There is a crow benefit offset program, or some people would call a livestock subsidy, for hauling feed or feeding the farmers, feeding their own feed, in many cases to livestock for market. And that has been an Alberta characteristic for some time to help build up the livestock industry. Would the minister let the House know whether or not that will be an acceptable practice under the free trade agreement, or has that been cleared yet through this Washington?
It's my understanding, Mr. Speaker, that that still would be permissible under the free trade agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Go on to the next area. The House, and I'm sure the minister is quite aware that irrigation subsidies are paid in the form, I believe we pick up about 84% of the cost of headworks and water delivery to irrigation farmers. A lot of what the irrigation farmers produce, of course, will be sold to the U.S., supposedly in the Free Trade Pact. Now, will this 84%, 16% split, 84% paid by the provincial government, be considered a bottom loading by the Americans and an unfair subsidy for products produced from our irrigation farms?
Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member is aware, both the Department of Environment, which is more so involved than ourselves, and ourselves are involved in helping to offset some of the irrigation costs in southern Alberta. It is our opinion that those programs that we presently have in existence will be maintained, and we plan to keep them.
Mr. Speaker, I'm worried about his opinion. His opinion, it doesn't carry too far in Washington, even less farther than it does on this side of the House. But I think those are very important things that should be checked, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the last question is that this government has announced a $4 million grant, not a guarantee, a grant to Cargill, one of the American multinationals, to proceed with a beef packing plant in southern Alberta. Now, was that $4 million grant cleared, or do you assume just because it's a large American multinational that it will go anyhow? Was the $4 million grant cleared with Washington to make sure that beef sold from this plant wouldn't be considered bottom loaded, or is it because it's American owned that you don't think there'll be any trouble anyhow?
The chair looks forward to the answer, but these questions have been top loaded and bottom loaded.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member who represents the Liberal Party might run to Washington and Ottawa to receive his directions. We on this side do not. We made the decision based on what we believe is best for the cattle industry. It is going to allow us to develop further food processing within the province, and it's a very beneficial step for the agricultural sector within the province of Alberta.
Member for Little Bow.
Mr. Speaker, a supplementary question to the Minister, and it's in terms of an examination of all of our various agricultural industries relative to the free trade proposal. Could the Minister indicate what the approach is from the departmental level, and after findings are determined in these various sectors of agriculture, will there be a paper presented to this legislature that will be available to Albertans as well?
Mr. Speaker, we presently have a paper as it relates to the trade agreement in general terms that I'm more than happy to send to the honourable member, whereby it goes through a question and answer proposition as to how it will affect the various sectors. In addition, there is a mechanism, I understand, and I must admit to the honourable member I don't know all the details as it relates to this agreement, but there is a mechanism included in the agreement that we will have an opportunity to overview a number of programs that might be considered as being not holding to the tradition of the agreement, which we will be making representation to as time goes on. But overall, I would share with the honourable member, as I'm sure he would concur, there is such a positive aspect to this agreement as it relates to our agricultural sector when we acknowledge the amount of agricultural goods that do flow to the United States, specifically from our province, that it would be disastrous if that border was closed off to us.
The member for Stettler, followed by Athabasca-Lac-La Biche.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was moved to rise on this question when I heard a reference by the member for West Loch Sturgeon calling our crow benefit offset a livestock subsidy, and I wonder if the minister could clarify exactly what the intent and function of the crow benefit offset program is.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to respond to the honourable member for Stettler, because I'm sure he is driving at the inaccuracy of the honourable member's statement as it relates to a subsidy, because in reality it is an offset to what we consider a discriminatory program under the method of payment that presently exists, and we are working very hard to try to have that done on a trial basis within this province so that we will have added further processing within the province of Alberta.
Athabasca-Lac-La Biche.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Agriculture, a supplementary. Canada has agreed to eliminate its Western Grain and Transportation Act subsidies on agricultural products shipped to the United States through Western Canadian ports. Now, this will mainly affect the rapeseed and mill feed exported. Now, would the minister please confirm that this will be, for the canola producers, this will be basically a rape on their export because they will still be facing under the Mulroney trade agreement the countervailing duties that the Americans have on the canola product.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to repeat what I indicated to the honourable member for West Loch Sturgeon in his original question as it related to the canola industry, whereby the U.S. has agreed in turn to drop the ad valorem tax of 7.5%, which equals fairly well the transportation assistance that our canola industry has received to date under the Western Grain Transportation Act. So the two will offset each other. There is a legitimate concern, though, as it relates to the time period, and we are making representations so that the time period is equal with the reduction of both those programs.
The Leader of the Representative Caucus, followed by the member for Lethbridge West, followed by the member for Calgary Mountain View.
Speaker, my question is to the Provincial Treasurer. This week we've had a lot of discussion on the health of various financial institutions. My concern is are the Treasury branches of the province of Alberta, where we've had, as of March 31st, 1987, a $118 million deficit. My question to the Minister, could the Minister indicate whether he or departmental officials have conducted an analysis of the major components of that deficit as to whether it relates to loans on a personal basis, small business, or from the farming sector of this province?
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to provide some information with respect to the Treasury branches. One of those fundamental institutions of Alberta, which go back to the populist movement during the period of the Social Credit Party. At least the Treasury branches have survived, Mr. Speaker, and I'm happy that they have. Let me indicate, Mr. Speaker, that we have done some considerable amount of work on the Treasury branch problem. First of all, to correct the facts, the total losses this year are not $118 million. If you allow me just the working on the rough numbers, it's about $40 million this year and approximately the difference last year. And so what we've seen here is a two-year effect. Similar to other financial institutions, Treasury branches have had significant percentages of losses showing up in their loan portfolios. And as I've said before, this is common to all financial institutions, including the large banks, by the way, who have suffered a considerable amount of loan losses in Western Canada over the past 3 to 4 years. And we have found that the losses in the Treasury branch are essentially of that order. They're losses in real estate, where in fact mortgages were foreclosed and property put back on the assets of the Treasury branch itself and therefore had to be revalued in light of the new situation. Losses, some losses on the farming manufacturing side, and significant losses on energy loans. And so we'd expect if those two sectors in Alberta have been poor performers or been under severe pressure from external forces, that the losses or the portfolios, the losses in the portfolio of the Treasury branch would be similar to that of other financial institutions. And that's the case, as a matter of fact. We would expect that in 1988 there will be improvement in the income of the Treasury branches. But let me note that it is in fact a clear case where going through these transitions, the company has had to adjust. They've had to take loan losses driven by the same tests applied to other financial institutions. And these are showing up now on the bottom line, so to speak, of the Treasury branch.
Mr. Speaker, I was soon running out of supplementaries.
Just keep at it. He'll run dry eventually.
Hopefully not the Treasury branches. Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the Minister. The Minister has commented publicly that the government has, by inference or directly, urged that the Treasury branches take higher risks in terms of loans to the people of Alberta, and that could have had an effect on this deficit. Could the Minister indicate whether that statement is an accurate assessment of the government's policy up to this point in time? And will there be some restructuring in terms of that policy as a directive from government?
Mr. Speaker, I think during the period since 1983, certainly 1986, when it was reported or suggested that some of the large banks in particular were not providing adequate dollars to Alberta for normal kinds of investments. We, in discussions in our caucus, in discussions with the management of the Treasury branch, suggested that if the banks are moving away from Alberta or backing out, which has been reported, that in fact the Treasury branches should do all they can to secure the investment-driven decisions in this province, and they have done that. And therefore, I think you might suggest that on a normal banking basis, they're taking marginally greater risks than some of the other financial institutions. At the same time, I think that's appropriate, because that's why that entity was set up, and that's the way in which it is operating. But they are still applying the normal tests with respect to prudent portfolio management, with respect to prudent loan decisions, but to a very great extent, they are cognizant of the needs in Alberta for a secure and substantial flow of funds into investment decisions, and that's what they're doing.
Mr. Speaker, my final supplementary will relate to the final phrase of my last supplementary in terms of restructuring. Could the Minister indicate what type of directives or policy changes would occur for any kind of restructuring?
Again, Mr. Speaker, I would hope that I could get in on the last and make it clear what we intend to do. If in fact there is a problem, I guess it's incumbent upon the government to act, and we will do just that. Let me point out that in the case of the Treasury branches, this unique institution, they do not have the so-called equity base. I guess the equity base of the Treasury branches are all the assets of the government itself. And still, this province is the only province with net assets, I might say, in parentheses. But the Treasury branch as an entity do not have any equity. They haven't got any shareholders' capital. And against my argument some time ago, the government has transferred any surpluses from the Treasury branch into general revenue. I thought they should have left that in the Treasury branch and could have dealt with the kinds of unforeseen losses which we had this year. However, that was not done, and so we have to find some way to put some capital, if you like, back into the Treasury branches. Now, it's operating as a fund, it's operating under the arm of government, and therefore it's somewhat difficult, given our legislation in the Financial Administration Act, to do just that. But we're looking at ways that we can correct some of these problems. I think the Act may well be flawed to some extent in that that problem cannot be rectified or changed, and we're looking at ways to remedy that. On a broader basis, we're looking at ways to expand cooperation with Treasury branches, with other financial institutions as well, working in cooperation with current entities here to make it work. As a final point, let's remember that Alberta is the only province that has a Treasury branch system. And when you say that the financial institutions in this province are eroding and removing, other provinces are looking at the Treasury branch example of ways to deal with the problem in their own province, and we should be thankful that this entity is operating as effectively as here in the province, the 19th largest financial institution in Canada, by the way.
Moving from supplement.
The provincial treasurer had a request from the Canada Deposit Insurance Corporation to have the insurance amount limited in the Treasury branches to $60,000, similar as other institutions in Canada.
Again, my colleague from Lethbridge raises one of the fundamental points I like to have on the record. That is, all deposits in the Treasury branch are 100% guaranteed by the province of Alberta. We are not concerned with CDIC or other limits. It's 100% guarantee for any deposit in the Treasury branch in Alberta.
Edmonton Meadowlark.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. To the Treasurer, since the Treasury branches have written down their assets over the last 2 years by less than 10%, in light of the fact that private sector institutions have experienced write-downs of 30, 40, 50%, could the Minister please inform the House whether more rigorous evaluations, more market-based evaluations of Treasury branch assets would in fact have resulted in greater losses greater than the $118 million experienced by the Treasury branches over the last 2 years?
I can't say no to that, Mr. Speaker, but I can simply explain the process that we're going through. As I've indicated, valuations of real estate holdings in particular, or certainly mortgages outstanding against real estate loans, are under some pressure right now. But in conjunction with the Auditor General, who expresses an opinion on these financial statements, the management of the Treasury branch and, to some extent, the government has been working with all three groups to try to bring together a formula which would recognize and put in place an appropriate way to measure losses, similar to what's being done in other financial institutions. To some extent, the change in approach to writing off losses or providing for losses accounted for the significant increase in losses last year. But I think it's safe to say that we are using the normal financial approach to recording these losses. The provision for the losses is similar to other financial institutions, and I would suggest that it's probably appropriate in that context and has not understated the value of the assets in Treasury branch.
Member for Lethbridge West, followed by the member for Calgary Mountain View, followed by the member for Calgary Buffalo, then Lloydminster, Edmonton Strathcona, Red Deer North, Wainwright, Glengarry, Highwood. Anyone else? Lethbridge West, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Forgive me, member for Lethbridge West, request for supplementary, but one should really be jumping up much faster. Member for Edmonton Kingsway. Final supplementary on this question.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Treasurer about the Treasury branches is this. Would he agree that much of the Treasury branch problem is really because the Treasury branches loaned some $650 million to Northwest Trust between the years 1983, 84, and 85, and that the CDIC money of just over $200 million was not enough to cover those bad losses?
Well, Speaker, we've had this curious debate for some time with the member from the member who just asked the question. And I can only say that not only was he confused before, but he is still confused in this issue. In fact, the arrangement with Northwest Trust and CDIC, where in fact Northwest Trust was brought back to financial stability by taking federal government money, $277 million, putting it into Northwest Trust, ending up with a very strong financial institution which is serving the needs of Albertans, well-financed, cleaned up, and with the real estate now in the government's hands as well. That as a result of that transaction, which cost the people of Alberta not 1 cent, In fact, some of the advances to Northwest Trust by the Treasury branch became profitable, and in fact it added to the balance sheet, did not add to the losses at all. Now the numbers that the gentleman used are simply not accurate.
Member for Lethbridge West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a question to the Minister of Community and Occupational Health that's been raised by a constituent of mine this past week, and it concerns the Public Health Act and eating establishments in government-owned buildings. And inasmuch as the Public Health Act is not binding on the Crown, Mr. Speaker, I wanted to ask the Minister, could the Minister advise the House what precautions are taken to assure the public that eat in eating establishments in Crown-owned buildings as to the safety of both the food preparation and the serving of the food?
Mr. Speaker, private sector operators operating within a government-owned facility are in fact bound by the Public Health Act, and therefore that protection should be in place because of that act.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, in view of the fact that under the government's privatization program there appears to be a rapid increase in privately owned operators within these buildings, could the Minister then advise the House what the process is for public health inspectors of health units in Alberta to enter those provincial buildings without an order being issued?
Well, again, Mr. Speaker, regardless of the building in which the operation is housed, public health inspectors may have access to and have access to premises that are operated by private sector operators. So it's simply not, there's no requirement for any kind of permit or special arrangements for access. And as for public government-run operations that should be inspected by public health inspectors, Mr. Speaker, we have arranged that those operations will be accessed by public health inspectors.
A final supplementary, Mr. Speaker, then, in view of the Minister's comments, could the Minister assure the members of this House that the cafeteria within this building, which is operated by a private operator, has in fact recently been inspected by the Edmonton Board of Health?
Mr. Speaker, I don't keep track of public health inspectors in the 27 health units across this province, but I'm sure that if there is a concern that the honourable member would like to bring to my attention, I would certainly approach the Edmonton Board of Health to ensure that such an inspection would take place.
Member for Calgary Mountain View.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Recreation and Parks. The provincial government has spent $25 million to build a ski hill at Mount Allen, even when there was evidence and lots of advice that that was not the place to build it. There would be problems, not enough snow, and so on. Now there are indications, Mr. Speaker, that the private sector operators lost $1.2 million on operations there last year. Given the small number of skiers, less than expected, will the Minister confirm that the provincial government received virtually nothing last year by way of concession and land use fees and will receive nothing this year?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the chairman, or to the honourable member, the question is perhaps partially hypothetical, but I think is deserving of an answer. Partially. That, yes, the ski hill was built at a cost of some $25 million, which I'm certainly pleased and proud that it was, because had it not been built, there would not be a facility in place to accommodate the Olympics or for the long-term recreational needs of Albertans and those who wish to pursue in that activity. Yes, the rental fee was restricted and income based on the amount of skiers, partially due to the weather, Mr. Speaker, and partially due to the learning experiences that the operators had to be encumbered with as well. There were several World Cup events held in the facility and training runs that we accommodated for the Olympic Organizing Committee that went very successful. I believe that we'll look forward to some good long-term recreational needs with the development of the hill, and I'm unable to predict or project at this time whether or not there will be any actual income in this calendar year.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Starting this past May of this year, OCO assumed a full-year operation of this ski area, including all the associated losses to run it, compared to Lake Placid, for example, which was closed only for the week prior to the '84 Winter Olympics. Would the minister confirm to the Assembly today that the estimated $2.2 million loss OCO will assume under this arrangement is in effect a subsidy to keep the private operator afloat at Nikiska for another year?
With due respect, Honourable Minister, just a moment. The time for question period has expired. Might we have unanimous consent of the House to complete this series of questions? Opposed? Minister?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to respond to clarify that, because it certainly is a misunderstanding by the honourable member as it's presented. The first commitment is to the Olympics, to see that that facility is in place and that we'd be able to fulfill those obligations.
On time, under budget.
Yes, on time and under budget, as I've heard to my right. But in doing so, we've had to look at the overall expertise of the operators. They bring that skill in management to the overall facilities. But in view of the conditions that were being imposed to run the Olympics, we've had to turn around and separate the recreational component side of it to the Olympic side of it. And in doing so, it would mean that there would be lost revenues, lost time, and to go back then to our first commitment and obligation to see that the Olympics took place. We made an arrangement with the organizing committee and Ski Kananaskis to see that took place.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year's operating loss of $1.2 million has basically eaten up the equity investment by the ski area's operators. Will the provincial government be prepared to extend further assistance, such as equity financing, or loan guarantees to Ski Kananaskis to enable them to keep afloat on an ongoing basis?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can't answer that this time because it's certainly an ongoing area that we'd have to be reviewing, and there's no further discussion this time or being entertained with regards to that. I might say, though, while I'm on my feet, Mr. Speaker, that maybe, and only maybe, does the initial decision to go ahead with the facility and with the operators supports the fact that they, the operators, lost the $1.2 million and not the government or the taxpayers of Alberta in the development of the Hill.
Mr. Speaker, to the Minister, well, given that we're collecting only about $25,000 a year on a $25 million investment, I'd like to ask how long the provincial government will allow these losses of $1 million and $2 million a year to mount up. How many years will these private operators be able to continue before the provincial government has to take over the operation of the ski hill?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it isn't the intent of the government to take over, and I'm surprised that the honourable member would ask that question because he was the one who raised so many different occasions to have the opportunity to review the overall conditions and lease agreements and so forth, which were provided to the honourable member. So if he'd like to go back and review his homework, perhaps he'd find out that the term of the lease was 5 years and the other conditions and factors that he's well aware.
Supplementary question, Calgary Buffalo.
Thank you. To the Minister, now that it's clear that Nikiska is on its way to being an ignominious failure, I wonder whether the Minister, facts speak for themselves. I wonder whether the Minister might comment on the reported policy of the government to encourage much greater development of facilities in the national parks.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I really view that as a separate...
Honourable Minister, indeed it is not a supplementary germane to the first question, the main line of questioning. Orders of the day. Might we revert briefly to the introduction of special guests? Edmonton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the public gallery are some students of the English as a second language program in my constituency with their teacher, Joan Farrell. I'd ask that they stand and receive the warm welcome of the members.
Orders of the day. What's the procedure? Oh, thank you. I had no notification. Member for Little Bow.
I haven't. I'd like to introduce three progressive young businessmen in the province of Alberta that have had the opportunity of working with me in a number of ways. I'd like to introduce the president of the Representative Party, Tom Carlton, if he would stand, and Tom Caruso and John Borhorst from southern Alberta. Three young gentlemen that are going to add lots to the economy of this province.
Additional guests for introduction, Westlock Sturgeon.
If I may add, Mr. Speaker, I'd also, although I hesitate because of where she is sitting, to also introduce one of my co-workers for many years, the Alberta Liberal Party, Pat Raymaker from Calgary.
The Chair would just like to point out for future reference, if there are indeed additional introduction of guests to